Bonjour et bienvenue à tous. My name is Dominique Scobry. I am Executive Director of the Alliance Française Miami Metro. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the third lecture in this winter Zoom series on the making of the Great Museum of Paris, from the beginning of the 20th century until today. Following last week's lectures by Sophie Matoche about the making and remaking of the Nissim de Camondo Museum, one of the great house museums of Paris, this week Russell Kelley will talk about the making and remaking of the Louvre Museum, surely the grand and the most ambitious of the presidential museum of the Fifth Republic. But before we get started on our travel through time, a reminder that we are using a Zoom webinar format. This means you can only see the guest speaker, so please use the chat line to communicate with all participants. Give it a try and tell us where you are listening from. We also ask you to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. They will be answered by our speaker at the end of the talk. Please note we also send you a recording a few days after each talk in the series. This program is presented by the Alliance Française Miami Metro and the Alliance Française de Chicago, with communication support from the Federation of Alliance Française USA, which oversees the more than 100 chapters of the Alliance Française all over the United States. A few words about Russell. Russell Kelley was the curator and moderator of the past 5 Winters Lectures series about the history of heritage of France. He has lived in Paris for 30 years and is the author of The Making of Paris, the story of how Paris evolved from a fishing village into the world's most beautiful city. Lions Press, 2021. His new book, Walking Through the Ages of Paris, 10 historical walking tours through the City of Life, will be published later this year. To you, Russell.
Merci, Dominique, and greetings to one and all. The theme of this lecture series is all about the making and remaking of the great museums of Paris, since all of the museums in Paris are constantly making and remaking themselves, reinventing themselves. The only constant in the museum world, as in so many other things, is change. 2 years ago, our series started with a lecture about the first museum created in Paris, the Louvre, which was created in the French Revolution in 1793. An excellent presentation by Françoise Mardrousse, who's in charge of the research department of the Louvre. If we had been able to organize this series of lectures, the last one would have also been about the Louvre, because it encapsulates everything that this series represents. It is a house museum like the Musée Nissim de Camondo that we saw last week. It is a private museum in a sense, as we will discuss, much like the Fondation Cartier we will talk about next week. It is perhaps the greatest of the presidential museums, somewhat like the Centre Pompidou that we will talk about in 3 weeks. And it is certainly a universal museum combining all of the above. But first we will start talking about the History Museum of the Louvre, which is the building itself. And while I start this, I should quote Blaise Pascal, who famously said, "If I had more time, I would have prepared a shorter presentation." So bear with me. If you have to leave before it's over, I quite understand. So this is the Louvre today. And it's the result of no fewer than 21 building campaigns between 1546 and 1880, plus two more before 1546 and two more after 1880. 25 so-called building campaigns to create this museum, which is why it is in itself a history museum and why I'm going to go back to the very beginning to understand how it came about. It dates back to around 1200 when Philippe II, built a wall around the left and right banks of Paris. And to protect the western entrance to Paris, outside the wall and outside a moat, he built the Louvre fortress, which was just outside on the right bank, the ville. The Cité was the island, and the Université was on the left bank. A couple hundred years later, 150 years later, Charles V built a second wall around the right bank only, rendering the Louvre as a defensive fortress redundant, since it was no longer protecting the entrance to the city, and allowing Charles V, who built the wall, to transform the Louvre from a fortress into a palace, the second building campaign. Then we fast forward to François Ier and his son Henri II. François Ier demolished the great tower, the donjon that was in the original fortress, and he started to build the first Renaissance wing, which was designed by the architect Lescaut and was finished by his son Henry II, and is now called the Lescaut wing. François Ier started the Royal Art Collection that was the basis of the Louvre's first collection. Literally the year that he became king, a very young king, in 1551, he set off for Italy for one of the Italian wars and won a spectacular battle at Marignan and returned to the Loire Valley and this Amboise Chateau with the great artist Leonardo da Vinci, who resided next door in the Clos Lucé until he died 3 years later. Leonardo died not really in the arms of François Ier as portrayed in this image, but he did sell his painting, La Joconde, Mona Lisa, to François Ier, which was the beginning of the Royal Art Collection. Here's the new Renaissance ring by Pierre Lescaut with decorations by Jean Goujon, finished by Henry II. And there it is on the Cour Carrée. It's to the left of the pavilion. That wing to the left of the pavilion is the Lescaut wing. Le voilà. And at the ground floor of the Lescaut wing is the magnificent Salle des Caryatides, the Hall of the Caryatids, with sculptures of the Caryatids by the same Jean Goujon who did the decorations on the facade. And these Caryatids were inspired by the Maiden Porch at the Acropolis of in Athens. And it is there that Marguerite de Valois and Henri III de Navarre, the future Henri IV, King Henry IV, were celebrated their marriage in 1572. So Marguerite's mother and Henry IV's mother-in-law, Catherine de Medici, after her husband Henri II died in a stupid dueling accident, she built a chateau for herself outside the Charles V wall, named the Chateau des Tuileries. She built the central pavilion, and a little bit later, the pavilion to the right, which is called the Pavillon de Flore. And then later, uh, under Louis XIV. Louis de Vaux built the one on the left called the Pavillon Marsan. And out behind the chateau, the palace, the Tuileries, Catherine de Medici built the first Renaissance garden in Paris, the Jardin des Tuileries. So her son-in-law, Henri IV, built the dramatic Grande Galerie to connect the Louvre, which was to the right here, with the Palais des Tuileries, stretching 500 yards along the Seine, also known as the Waterside Gallery. Represented here, the Louvre is represented here in 1615, right after the death of Henri IV. And this highlights at the top the Petite Galerie that connects the old Louvre with the Grande Galerie, which is the long stretch along the Seine, and then it ends in the Pavillon de Flore. Louis XIV shows up. He redesigns the Petite Galerie. He nearly completes the Cour Carrée, which had been started by his son Louis XIII. He built the Pavillon de Marsan, as I mentioned earlier, and he redesigned the Jardin des Tuileries. He's most closely associated, of course, with Versailles, Louis XIV, but obviously he had a lot to do with the Louvre as well. So the arrows point to the Petite Galerie, which he redesigned, and I'll show you more about that. And he built the Pavillon de Marsan at the north end of the Chateau de Versailles, Chateau des Tuileries. The Petite Galerie had actually first been built by Henri IV to connect the Louvre with the Grande Galerie, but it was destroyed by fire in 1661. And when rebuilding it, Louis XIV had his architect, his decorator, Charles Lebrun, decorate the spectacular Galerie d'Apollon, Gallery of Apollo, because of course Apollo was the sun king, and so was Louis XIV. This magnificent roof, and it's used to display the French crown jewels, and it's become quite celebrated since October because that is the room from which the crown jewels were stolen on Sunday morning at 9:30 brazenly by 4 thieves. When Louis built the Petite Galerie, the new Petite Galerie, he doubled the width. When he built the Galerie d'Apollon, he doubled the width of the Petite Galerie, and the new room next to the Galerie d'Apollon was the Salon Carré. And right next to the old Louvre part became the Cour Carrée, the square courtyard with actually really identical lengths of each of the squares. And it's exactly 4 times the size of the original Louvre fortress. On the east facade of the Cour Carrée, Louis had built La Colonnade, the spectacular facade that faced east, designed by the French architect with help, Claude Perrault. And he wanted to have a very particularly grand entrance for the east, on the east side. Why? It's because the Louvre at this point was at the western edge of the city of Paris. So anybody who would be entering the Louvre from Paris would be coming from the east. And they would be coming from either the Ile de la Cité or the Marais, which was particularly the aristocratic quartier at the time. Louis did not, however, finish the job. He didn't, as you can see from this wonderful bird's eye map, Plan de Turgot, he did not have time to finish putting on the roofs of the north and east wings before he moved to Versailles. But he did have time to have André Le Nôtre transform the Renaissance garden of Catherine de Medici into a classical garden, which is the garden that we know today. And it was part of André Le Nôtre's vision to create this grande perspective stretching out. And he built the Avenue des Tuileries all the way to the Butte Chaillot. The Avenue des Tuileries was later renamed the Avenue des Champs-Élysées, and the Butte Chaillot is where the Arc de Triomphe de l'Étoile is located. And a lot of this was done by Louis XIV at the instigation of his minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was a great builder, and he was a very cultured man. And he instigated the founding of four royal academies, including, well, this was actually had been established before the Académie de Peinture et de Sculpture, the Academy of Painting and Sculpture, predated Colbert. But when the court moved to Versailles from Paris in 1682, not to return until the Revolution, Versailles was more or less abandoned by the monarchy, and it was given over to the arts, and in particular, the Academy of Painting, along with the artists that formed the members of the Academy of Painting, moved into the Louvre 10 years after Louis departed, and the Louvre became a cultural hub. The Salle des Caryatides had been used to exhibit Louis' sculptures, and it was then known as the Salle des Antiques. And it's still used today to exhibit Greek sculptures and Roman copies of Greek sculptures. The works of the members of the Académie de Peinture et de Sculpture were displayed in the Grande Galerie, so it began to take on a definite museum vibe under the reign of Louis XIV. And the first Salon de Peinture et de Sculpture of the members of the Royal Academy was held in the Salon Carré, which had been built by Laveau right next to the Galerie d'Apollon in 1699. Louis XIV died in 1715, ending the 72-year, an incredibly long 72-year reign, which is summarized by Le Grand Siècle, the Great Century. And I commend to you, I hope that you can attend on February 12th, a lecture to be given by Alexandre Gady about the new Museum of the Grand Siècle in Saint-Cloud, which should open in 2 years' time. And he'll tell us all about the period of Louis XIV and what goes into making a brand new museum. Louis was followed by his great-grandson, believe it or not, his sons and grandsons having predeceased him, Louis XV, who resided at Versailles. But during his time, he still made substantial improvements to the Louvre and the vicinity of the Louvre. So it was under his reign that the Paris Salon des Artistes of Living Artists was inaugurated in 1737. And that became the famous salon where modern art by living artists was displayed every year in the Louvre until 1848 in the Salon Carré, and elsewhere until the end of the 19th century. And this is a pretty well stacked walls of the Salon Carré in the 1787. And you can see how it evolved. But they loved to stack paintings back then, right up to the ceiling. The last art exhibition was held in the Salon Carré in 1848. And then the Salon was redecorated by Félix Dubon and devoted to permanent museum use. It looks great here. It looks great there. And through the door at the back there, you can see the Grande Galerie. And you can still see it today, but the room doesn't look so terrific anymore. I believe it still has the ceiling, but obviously not the walls. So Louis XV also redesigned the Place or designed, I should say, because it was the creation of the first proper square to the west of the Tuileries Garden. It was called Louis XV after the king by the architect Ange Jacques Gabriel. It was renamed the Place de la Révolution during the Revolution, and after the Revolution, the Place de la Concorde. Louis XV was succeeded by his son Louis XVI, and who resided at Versailles, but the Comte de Angevillers was appointed director of the buildings of the king. And he's shown in this painting holding plans for the Grand Louvre, which he wanted to turn into a museum to display the royal art collection, painting collection. The Grand Gallery would have looked something like this in 1789. The revolution broke out. Women marched on Versailles October 5th. 1789, the royal family was left Versailles for the last time and moved into the Tuileries Palace. 3 years later, Louis was arrested. The monarchy was abolished. The First Republic was established. Louis was found guilty of treason and beheaded on the Place de la Révolution in January 93. And his wife followed, had the same fate 10 months later. As part of the revolution, all churches were closed and all church property was confiscated. And after the monarchy was abolished, all royal property was confiscated along with the property of all aristocrats in exile. So the Louvre is now owned by the people, and it becomes one of the first four museums, but the first art museum created in Paris, which was then known as the Musée Central des Arts. And it included not only the royal collection, but also arts of work that were confiscated from the church and arts of work that were confiscated from exiled aristocrats who went into exile. There were 573 paintings, and as you can see, they were stacked. Again, it was exclusively located in the Grand Gallery. Napoleon Bonaparte shows up. He was a general at age 24. He was first consul at age 30, and he was emperor at age 35. He created the Musée Central des Arts was renamed the Musée Napoléon in 1803. It started with the royal collections on artworks of churches and aristocrats, but he added to it substantially by looting from Egypt and continental Europe works of art in what were known as conquêtes artistiques. And we have to remember that back in the day, if you conquered a country, you basically took whatever you wanted. And that was called the droit de conquête, the right of conquest, but few people applied that right or enforced that right more diligently than Napoleon. During the Italian campaign, his first campaign, he started looting. He wasn't the first one who did this during the French Revolutionary Wars, but he got into it big time. Among the ones that he took from Italy in 1797 was the wedding feast at Cana. He also took the horses of St. Mark from the St. Mark Basilica in Venice, and he installed them on top of the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel, which stood in front of the Palais des Tuileries in the background. He looted the sculpture of Laocoon and his sons from the Vatican. And here's an image of all of the loot arriving on the Champ de Mars in Paris in 1798. Then Napoleon set off on the Egyptian expedition. There he is looking at the Sphinx, and he started to carry out excavations there. He took with him on the exhibition to Egypt 167 scholars and scientists, including Dominique Vivant-Denon, uh, who were responsible for taking a huge number of objects away as a result of these excavations, but most of them were lost to the British after the British defeated the French at the Battle of the Nile in 1798, including the famous Rosetta Stone, which ended up in the British Museum. So here we have the Dominique Vivant-Denon, who had been on the exhibition with Napoleon in Egypt, and he was appointed the first director of the Musée Central des Arts, which became the Musée Napoléon, which became the Musée Royal du Louvre after Napoleon. And he kept a inventory of all of the art in the museum, which came to 17 volumes. So the collection of the museum expanded exponentially during the Napoleonic era. And Dominique Vivant-Denon developed the fields of art history, museology, and particularly Egyptology, overseeing the publication of the description of Egypt, which established Egyptology as an intellectual discipline and inspired the passion for Egyptian art in the 19th century. The art in the Musée Napoléon was not all looted. He also purchased the Borghese collection from his brother-in-law in 1807. Hubert Robert proposed to install skylights in the ceiling of the Grand Gallery back then. In the end, Napoleon's architects Percier and Fontaine installed lateral skylights in the Grand Gallery. And it was just after that that Napoleon married his second wife, Maria Luisa of Austria, in 1810. Napoleon also built the Galerie Neuve, the new gallery on the north wing of the Louvre. Battle of Waterloo, Bourbon Restoration with Louis XVIII and Charles X. Congress of Vienna at the conclusion, after the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, ordered the restitution of looted artworks. There were over 5,000 pieces of art were returned to their countries of origin, but nearly half of the looted works remained in France. The horses were returned to St. Mark's. The original horses of St. Mark were replaced by copies in 1828, which are still there. The wedding feast at Cana was deemed too big and too fragile to travel, so it was agreed to exchange it for the feast of the House of Simon by Louis XIV's architect, Charles Lebrun. The god of the Tiber was similarly deemed to be too large and too expensive to transport, so it stayed at the Louvre. So the Louvre is now confronted with a situation when it just lost 5,000 pieces of art, so it has to reinvent itself one more time. And they set about it, and it's an unending process. The acquisition of new collections that's provoked by the loss of all of the looted collections of Napoleon. So the Louvre purchased antique sculptures previously seized from the collection of Albany. And during the 19th century, there was a huge number of archaeological excavations. Started with the French excavations in Egypt, but was followed by many other excavations throughout the Near East, largely related to colonial expansion. And as a result of these excavations that the Louvre's ancient and Near Eastern art collections were created. And this also was, one can say, the beginning of the Louvre's mission or ambition to become a universal museum, not just showing European or Western art, but art from all over the world, not just showing work from the Renaissance onwards, but showing work from all history, all periods of history. Some of the most famous works in the Louvre came about as a result of excavations. The Venus de Milo was discovered on the island of Milos in 1820 and was acquired by the French ambassador and presented to Louis XVIII, who donated her to the Louvre. The Rosetta Stone had been discovered by French soldiers, but as I said, it was captured by the British after the Battle of the Nile and brought to the British Museum, which meant that Jean-François Champollion did not examine the stone proper, but copies of the etchings on the stone in order to decipher its meaning starting in 1822. And he succeeded spectacularly, and as a result of his incredible scholarship, was appointed curator of the Louvre's new Egyptian Antiquities Department in 1826. Another museum, they call them separately museums. They might have been called departments these days, but it was called a Musée de la Marine within the Musée du Louvre, opened in 1827, later transferred to the Musée de la Marine in the Palais de Chaillot. Louis-Philippe succeeded Charles X, and he was the king of the French. He created the Spanish Gallery and the Assyrian Museum, as well as redesigning the historic axis. Spanish Gallery consisted of 450 paintings that were purchased by Louis Philippe with his own funds and opened in the Cour Carrée in 1838. The Assyrian Museum was created 9 years later as a result of excavations carried out by the French consul Paul-Émile Botta, and this was the beginning of Near East archaeology. And those pieces that are now on display in this, what's called the Corspad courtyard in the Richelieu wing of the Louvre. Spectacular lions here. And Louis Philippe, in addition, he took the more or less completed the Grande Perspective in first envisioned by André Le Nôtre by redesigning the Place de la Concorde, installing in its center the Luxor obelisk, and then at the top of the Champs-Élysées, he completed the construction of the Arc de Triomphe. Here we have the Place de la Concorde redesigned by Jacques-Ignace Ittorf with the Luxor obelisk. Took 8 months to transport, 3 hours to erect, and you can see it attracted a crowd. It was quite an engineering triumph. Speaking of triumph, the Arc de Triomphe, which had been started by Napoleon I, but not completed until Louis Philippe. The view from the Arc de Triomphe looking towards the Tuileries down the Champs-Élysées, creating what is now known as the Axe Historique, which was centered, looking at the arrows at the bottom of the image there. The top arrow points to the central pavilion of the Tuileries Palace, and the bottom arrow points to the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel built by Napoleon with now copies of the horses of St. Mark on top. And that Arc de Triomphe is perfectly centered on the central pavilion of the Palais des Tuileries, which will become relevant later. Here you have the view, fantastic view with the historic axis showing the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel, the pavilion, central pavilion of the Tuileries, the obelisk, and the Arc de Triomphe de l'Étoile. 4 o'clock, time for closing time. We're closing. That was the last art exhibition held in the Salon Carré in 1848. You can see on the left of this image the huge painting of the wedding at Cana. Louis Philippe was overthrown during the June days of 1848. He fled to London and took his Spanish collection with him. He was succeeded by Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon I, who was elected the first and only president of the Second Republic. And in that capacity, he initiated the founding of the Mexican or American Museum with art, pre-Columbian art. So this was a move away from Western art. Now he's talking about pre-Columbian art in Latin America. And the Musée Napoleon had been in during Napoleon I era, was in the Grand Galerie, and it stayed in the Grand Galerie in the Musée Impérial, a change of name, but same location. All of the Louvre Museum was located in the Grand Galerie. After he was president, he staged a coup and became emperor of the Second Empire, did Louis Napoleon. And he is immediately created the Musée des Souverains, the Museum of Sovereigns, with objects associated with former French monarchs transferred from other museums, including this magnificent 7th century bronze throne of Dagobert, the Merovingian king. Georges Eugène Haussmann was known for the Grand Travaux, where he totally remade Paris, but he had nothing to do with the Louvre. The Louvre was designed by Louis Visconti, who presented his plan for the Nouveau Louvre to Napoleon and his wife Eugénie, Spanish wife Eugénie. And he had to confront the biggest problem was the problem of oblique angles, because if you look here, you see the west facade of the Cour Napoleon, the Cour Carré on the right is not parallel with the Palais des Tuileries on the left. And neither are the Grand Galerie and the New Galerie Neuve at the bottom and top of the screen there. And it's for the simple reason that when the Chateau des Tuileries was constructed, there was a wall, the Charles V wall, that separated it from the Louvre. So he had to come up with how was he going to resolve this conflict? And Louis Visconti came up with this brilliant idea of creating inner annexes that would be perfectly symmetrical. And yes, if you extended it all the way to the line, all the way to the Palais des Tuileries, it was a little bit off center, but that was so far away you really couldn't tell, and it couldn't be avoided. So his brilliant idea was to create the inner annexes that you can see marked in red on this image. And this was his plan, and this is what happened. But he was not carried out, sadly, by Visconti because he died in 1153. It was carried out by Hector Le Fuel and Félix Dubon. And here's where they started. You see the Cour Carré pointing at the right, and the Arc de Triomphe de Carrousel at the left arrow. Lots of buildings in between. So those were all demolished by Le Fuel. And in green, you see the wings constructed by Le Fuel as designed pursuant to Visconti's design, creating the new Cour Napoleon. So back to the collections again. The Winged Victory of Samothrace, discovered again thanks to excavations carried out by a French consul, this one Charles Champoiseau, and acquired by the Louvre in 1864. And it was installed at the top of the Escalier d'Arru, which had been designed by Le Fuel. So how other ways to acquire the collection. Giampietro Campana was a great collector who unfortunately got himself in trouble with the Vatican, and therefore his collection was seized. Most was sold to Tsar Alexander III, but 1,800 plus works were purchased by Napoleon III for the Louvre. Louis Lacaze, on the other hand, bequested his collection of paintings to the Louvre. And many other people followed his example. As you can see, there were substantial charitable donations of art to the Louvre in the following 40 years, but in beyond that, and it's continued to this day. So it's donations, acquisitions, no more plundering. So here's the Louvre of Napoleon III, spectacular Nouveau Louvre. And there's what happened to it on May 24th, 1871. At the last week of the Commune, the communards set fire to anything associated with the government, including the Louvre. And a lot more. This is the Rue de Rivoli, right next to the Louvre, on the north side of the Louvre. And that's where the Ministry of Finance had been located, and that's their building, which was totally destroyed. Therefore, the Ministry of Finance moved into the north wing of the Louvre in 1871. This is the Palais des Tuileries before the fire, and this is after the fire. The Pavillon de Marsan was very badly damaged. Pavillon de Flore at the other end of the Palais des Tuileries was less badly damaged. As a result, the Pavillon de Marsan had to be demolished and was rebuilt by Hector Lefeuille, the same Hector Lefeuille, and the Pavillon de Flore was repaired by him. And this was the last construction of the Louvre, the last building campaign of the Louvre until 1981. The ruins of the Palais were destroyed or finally demolished. They considered rebuilding it, but ultimately, after 12 years, it was decided to demolish the Chateau des Tuileries ruins. Before and after, the arrow at the bottom points to where the Tuileries Palace was located between the two pavilions, and the arrow at the top points to the Arc de Triomphe de Carousel, which had been right in front of the primary entrance. And so what you have here at this point, it's interesting to note, is you've got the Louvre is a 19th century palace, basically the palace built by Napoleon III, attached to the 17th century Cour Carrée of Louis XIV, 13th, 14th, and 15th. Finally, the Louvre was designated a historic monument in 1888, a little bit late. The first monuments dated back to 1840. The Musée des Arts Décoratifs moved into the Marsan wing in 1905. The École du Louvre moved from elsewhere in the Louvre to the floor wing in 1998. In 1897, the Société des Amis du Louvre was created, which is another way to increase the collection. So they got money, they collected money from donors to purchase works to give to the Louvre. They did it either all by themselves, or the Friends of the Louvre did it as together with the Réunion des Musées Nationaux, which had been created 2 years earlier to acquire works of art for the national collections of the four national museums: the Louvre, Versailles, Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and the Musée de Luxembourg. So the ambition to become a universal exhibition started to move away, to be distilled, diluted, I should say, in the 20th century, more focus on Western art. The non-Western artifacts were moved to a new museum, d'Ethnography and the Trocadero. Far Eastern museums were moved to a museum, Musée Guimet, focused on Far Eastern art. Impressionists moved to the Musée du Jeu de Paume and then to the Musée d'Orsay. In other words, during the 20th century, there was a gradual specialization with the creation of new museums focused on specific periods or types of art. And the Louvre transferred its part of its collection as a result. So a move away from being a universal museum. World War I, nothing happened, thank goodness. Entre deux guerres, there was a program of modernization carried out by director Henri Verne, and he reorganized how exhibits were displayed by styles and periods, stopped stacking paintings, held the first exhibitions with loaned works of art, not just works from the collection of the Louvre itself, and he actually introduced electricity to the museum for the first time. Also, visitors started to have to pay 1 franc starting in 1922. The Darou's staircase was renovated and with the Wings of Victory still at the top, and that is still what you see today. The Cour des Sphinx was covered in the 1930s. The Grand Galerie had this so-called salon-style stacking system of paintings until 1939, and finally they changed to pretty much a one at a time. One, except smaller ones you can still see are stacked, double stacked, but not more than that. You want to be more or less at eye height. World War II, artworks were moved to the countryside, but the Louvre reopened with a modified, a modest collection of art. Very few pieces were returned before the liberation of Paris. Fast forward now to François Mitterrand, president for 14 years and great builder along the lines of Napoleon III. And he's the first guy to carry out significant building works in Paris since Napoleon III. His Grand Projet and the Grand Louvre, aided by his ambitious Minister of Culture, Jacques Lang. His big project, the Grand Louvre project, Mitterrand selected I.M. Pei as his architect. He did it single-handedly based on the work that I.M. Pei had done on the East Building of the National Gallery and the West Wing of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He said, "This is the man for me." He did not do an international competition as is customary. He picked I.M. Pei himself. And he carried out I.M. Pei the 22nd and 3rd building campaigns, the first building campaigns since Napoleon, since the rebuilding of the Pavillon de Marsan, the Pavillon de Flore. First phase involved building the famous pyramid and this vast underground space, which the surface area of which is as large as the above ground space. The Cour Napoleon in 1965 was a parking lot for the Ministry of Economy that occupied the North Wing. I.M. Pei tore it up, dug a giant hole, and built on top of it the pyramid, which is effectively a giant skylight. And below it is the reception area. So you could go from there to any part of the Louvre because it was in the middle. No longer was the museum going to be limited to the Grand Galerie on the south wing of the Louvre. Remember that the Ile Richelieu had been occupied by the Ministry of Finance since 1872. Well, they moved to Bercy grudgingly in 1990, and the second phase of the restoration of the Grand Louvre project started, which meant renovating the North Wing and converting it to entirely to museum space. A discovery there was the Napoleon III apartments, which were the Minister of State's apartments. Napoleon III did not reside there, but they were perfectly preserved. They were not touched by the Ministry of Finance. So this is how they looked in 1871 when the Ministry of Finance moved in, and this is how they look today. Also, part of the second phase was the construction of this giant shopping center, underground shopping center, the Carousel du Louvre, which opened in 1993. And the centerpiece is the so-called inverted pyramid. The roads go around this area, this roundabout area in the center there. Passage Richelieu reopened between two courtyards where the arrow is. The courtyards, brilliant work by, again, by I.M. Pei. Looking at the courtyards on the north wing, the Richelieu wing, the Cour Puget before another parking lot. It was afterward, it is covered and it now features the sculptures of Pierre Puget. Cour Marly was covered and now features the sculptures taken from the gardens of the Chateau de Marly, west of Paris. On the south wing, the Cour Visconti was covered with this remarkable roof, and under it is the Islamic art department, an important move back towards being a universal exhibition, universal museum by including Islamic art. The Cour Le Feuille remained unchanged with its famous horseshoe staircase designed by Le Feuille for Napoleon III so that he could actually ride his horse into the Louvre. So remember that François Ier demolished the Grosse Tour back in 1528. Well, during excavation work in the Cour Carrée, it was discovered the foundation of the Grosse Tour. And now you can visit it in the basement of the Louvre, thanks to I.M. Pei's work. So the Grand Louvre tripled the Louvre's surface area, doubled the exhibition space, and attendance tripled as well. Louvre became an établissement public in 1992. What does that mean? It meant that it was now a separate entity responsible for its own financing, providing it, so I liken it in legal terms to a subsidiary rather than a simple branch. So you have the Louvre on the right, and on the left you see the Tuileries Garden, the beginning of the Tuileries Garden, which has been managed by the Louvre since 2005. So you can see it's roughly the same size as the Louvre. And it's now become effectively a sculpture garden with 120 sculptures from classical to contemporary. The God of the Nile, the Baiser, L'air by Aristide Maillol, Henry Moore, Jean Dubuffet, and this wonderful Tree of Vowels by Giuseppe Pinone. But perhaps the most spectacular thing, though, on display there these days is the Olympic cauldron from the Summer Games of 2024, which are still on display. They come back and they put the balloon with the cauldron beneath it in the Grand Bassin at the east end of the Tuileries Garden last summer, and they'll do it again this summer. And it never stops. The Louvre just keeps changing with new museums, contemporary art, non-Western art. They added two new museums in Lens. A new annex of the Louvre opened in 2012. Lens is a 1-hour TGV train ride from Paris. It's well worth of the visit. Louvre Abu Dhabi opened in 2017. It's a little bit further, 7.5 hour flight from Charles de Gaulle to Abu Dhabi. Haven't been there yet. And contemporary art was introduced to the museum, starting with Les Oiseaux by Braque in the ceiling of the Salle Henri II back in 1953, followed up in 2007 by three works by Ansel Kiefer. Cy Twombly painted a ceiling in the Salle des Bronzes. There's now this sculpture, The Wave of the South by Elias Crespin. I don't know how to pronounce his name. But my favorite was this JR installation. JR is the name of a French architect who does these wonderful installations with photographs. And this one is the Louvre. It's celebrating the 30th anniversary of the pyramid in 2019. So Luftuel added the Pavillon des Sessions to replace the Salle des États. Okay, we'll talk about what those are. Here's where it's located, right off of the Grande Galerie. And it was used to display the 24 paintings of the Marie de Medici cycle by Rubens, which is amazing. The 24 paintings. Totally giant format, over the top paintings about the life of Marie de Medici. And this has been converted now. It just opened last month as a Salon des Cinq Continents, 5 continents, expanding once again the range of the Louvre well beyond the Western art. Most of these items actually came from the Musée Jacques Chirac, Quai Branly Jacques Chirac. And there's a plan to open a new department, the Byzantine and Early Christian Art Department, next year. Again, a move towards being a universal museum. So the Louvre today is the most visited museum in the world, and that unfortunately makes it also the most crowded, even though they imposed a limit of 30,000 visitors per day in 2023, it is still incredibly crowded. Emmanuel Macron is best known for rebuilding Notre Dame, but he also has presidential museum ambitions. In fact, he gave his victory speech back in 2014 in front of the Pyramid du Louvre. And in January last year, literally a year and 1 day ago, he announced the Louvre Nouvelle Renaissance project to provide for a new entrance, new exhibition space for the Mona Lisa, a budget about what we have spent so far, has been spent so far on the restoration and rebuilding of Notre Dame. It's supposed to have an international competition to determine an architect, unlike they did with IMP, with a target completion date of 2031. The new entrance will be in front of the colonnade, facing the Ile de la Cité and the Marais. Now, the Salle des États here is where the Mona Lisa is. Originally, it was built, it's the largest room in the Louvre, and it was originally built to hold joint legislative sessions of the 2 houses of parliament during Napoleon III's time. During these sessions, Napoleon III would sit on his throne at the end of the room there. But when he was deposed, that room was closed, and it was redesigned to house larger 19th century French paintings, and the windows were closed. It was redesigned again in 1950, and the wedding at Cana became the star attraction, only to be upstaged by the arrival of the Mona Lisa in 1966. The Salle des États was renovated once again in 2019. This is what it looked like in 2020 during the COVID period. This is what it looks like, primarily to see the Mona Lisa, creating, as you can see, a considerable traffic jam. So there is a plan as part of the Nouvelle Renaissance project to build a new room for the Mona Lisa underneath the Cour Carrée. If you want to learn a lot more about the Louvre, I commend to you the annual report. The key numbers are the size of this place is staggering. 9 different departments. About a third of the money comes from the French state, and and that's declining, and about 2/3 is raised by the Louvre itself, primarily from ticket sales. And as a result, perhaps because of all the work that they now need to do, both for the Nouvelle Renaissance project, which doesn't take into consideration other issues that have come up since the theft in October. They're going to increase the ticket prices. They have increased the ticket prices for non-EU visitors from 32 euro to 32 euros from 22 euros, and they're not the only national museum doing that. Another source of income is the Louvre Abu Dhabi. Over the 30-year course of the license agreement, they will make over nearly €1 billion through licensing fees. The Louvre today is basically divided into 3 parts. On the right, around the Cour Carrée, and then you have the north wing, the Richelieu wing, and the south wing, the Denon wing. The Louvre today really does reflect, it's a history museum with its palace and 23 building campaigns that are extant. Art museum, 500,000 works of art. House museum with the Napoleon III apartments. Presidential museum with Mitterrand's Grand Louvre. Private museum, thanks to the donations from individuals and charitable association. It is a universal museum, but yes, it doesn't have the Impressionists. It doesn't have the primary arts that have been sent out to specialist museums, but it never stops reinventing itself. These are my favorite places to visit. In the Louvre, you'll see that Mona Lisa does not figure in this, so you probably can visit all of them without having to wait an hour. If you want to learn more, I commend to you the magnificent book, The Louvre by James Gardner, and the even more magnificent 3-volume masterpiece, The History of the Louvre, which talks about both the history of the museum and the history of the palace en français. I commend to you the talk that was given 2 years ago by Françoise Mardrousse about the Louvre Museum, which you can see on the websites, the YouTube channels of the Alliance Française de Miami Metro and Alliance Française de Chicago. And I will close with this interesting observation. Here we have the perfect symmetry of the Cour Napoleon, but the arrow is pointing to an equestrian statue of Louis XIV, famously not symmetrically placed. What is it doing there? Randomly. Well, if you want to find out, next time you're at the Louvre, walk up to the statue and turn around. And that's what you see. You see the axe historique lined up directly in front of you, because originally there had been the Palais des Tuileries there, but the axe historique was centered on the central pavilion of the Palais des Tuileries. But then again, so was the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel. So even though the Musée, the Palais des Tuileries isn't there, you can still get the perfect alignment, but it doesn't line up perfectly with the Cour Napoleon for the reasons I described earlier. So IMP insisted on putting the statue there to respect the axe historique. And it now stretches 2 miles to the Arc de Triomphe de Carrousel, from the Arc de Triomphe de Carrousel to the Arc de Triomphe de l'Étoile, and 3 more miles to the Grande Arche de la Défense. But it all starts at the Louvre. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Russell. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, so complete with such amount of information. I don't know if we have some question, but I would like to thank of our partners for their support. Thank you. Thanks to you for being with us. And obviously, see you next week. Do we have some question right now more? Is everything okay? So if everything is fine, I just want to tell you that we have another appointment next week, February 5th at 12 p.m. Chicago time, 1 p.m. Miami time, and 9 p.m. Paris time, when Béatrice Grenier will tell us about the making and remaking of the spectacular Fondation Cartier, one of the most important of the private museum in Paris. Au revoir, merci beaucoup et à très bientôt.